everyone. Welcome to a Energy Democracy Alliance webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about achieving an equitable clean energy transition through Community Choice Aggregation, or CCA. This webinar is hosted by the New York Energy Democracy Alliance, and we are a statewide alliance of community-based organizations, grassroots groups, and policy experts working together to advance a just and participatory transition to a resilient, localized, and democratically controlled clean energy economy here in New York State. We envision a renewable energy system that is led and prioritizes solutions for low and moderate income communities and communities of color who are most negatively impacted by our current energy and economic system. We transform our community's relationship to power through advocacy, organizing, job creation, coalition building, policy research, and public education for an equitable, sustainable future. So today we have a brief agenda. We're going to first go into what is community choice aggregation. Then we'll get into a deep dive into CCA 3.0, which is what we're all here to talk about, which is a really exciting new model of CCA. And then we'll hear from someone who is actually implementing CCA. And then we will go into a closing and a Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Avni, who will introduce our speakers, and then we will get right into it.
Thank you, Jasmine, for introing this webinar. I'm really excited to be introing the speakers who are going to be sharing some really awesome information from their work experiences with CCAs. So first up, we're going to have Jasmine Graham, who is the Energy Justice Policy Manager at WEACT for Environmental Justice, and they are responsible for strengthening and advancing the organization's energy policy. They joined from Sustainable Westchester, where they served as the Westchester Power Program Manager and developed initiatives to create and promote local renewable generation and community scale efficiency. Prior to that, she was a legislative researcher at the University of Vermont's Vermont Legislative Research Service, synthesizing economic and social policy issues and publishing legislative research reports. Next, we're going to hear from Meghan Shaw, who is the Outreach Director at Cambridge Energy Alliance in Massachusetts. And Meghan is the Outreach Director for the Cambridge Energy Alliance, which does energy efficiency and renewable energy programming for the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And she has a wealth of experience in implementing CCAs and uncovering the barriers to implementation. So we're really lucky to be hearing from her. Next and last, but certainly not least, we're going to have Paul Fenn, who is the founder and president of Local Power and best known as the creator of Community Choice Aggregation, and has 25 years of success developing this new energy system that allows communities to become energy independent. He's been widely recognized for multiple innovations in energy policy, law, finance, data analysis, program design, and engineering. So in addition to writing the original CCA law in Massachusetts 25 years ago and drafting the second generation law in California in 2000, Fenn was also recognized for several major political campaigns to defend CCAs. So one example is his work in creating and helping to run the campaign that actually defeated PG&E's Proposition 16, which was an astroturfed effort to hamstring CCA law in California. Paul also holds a master's degree with a PhD fellowship from the University of Chicago. He's also a published author, and he's recently written this third generation CCA 3.0 model for climate mobilization that we're all here to learn about today. And now I'm going to pass it on to Jasmine, who's going to get us started and really give us a good intro to all of this.
Fabulous. Thank you, Avni. Can we get the next slide, please? All right, so community choice aggregation, also known as CCA, allows municipalities or a group of municipalities to pool the buying power of residents and small businesses. This allows that group of municipalities to secure fixed rate renewable energy supply contracts, develop energy programs that are more tailored to the community needs and goals. It replaces the utility as the default supplier of electricity, but the utility maintains the responsibility for the delivery of your electricity and for your billing. So the way that I've always described this kind of program is it's like anything else where you buy in bulk, you get a better deal. You're able to leverage the buying power of a large group in order to have more say over your energy supply. Next slide, please. So typically your utility would both supply your electricity and deliver it to you. And you as the customer don't really have a say in it. You know, you move into a home or an apartment and you call the utility and you sign up for power and you get what you get. But CCAs are really a new model that allows a third party, which can be a nonprofit or a for-profit entity, or even a municipal agency, to buy or build energy supply for customers. So instead of your power coming through the utility or being sourced from the utility, it is sourced through your CCA. But as I said before, your utility still maintains all of your lines, all of the grid infrastructure, and you still get one bill from your utility. But you as a customer, you have more energy choice. And oftentimes CCAs are powered with renewable energy, and therefore you now have a renewable energy option. Next slide, please. So the existing CCA models can be that you are bulk purchasing renewable energy with a third-party administrator. An example of this is the Sustainable Westchester CCA in Westchester County, New York. You can have an intermunicipal organization as a CCA administrator, like the Cape Light Compact in Massachusetts. Or you can have a public authority as a CCA administrator, which is really called the CCA 2.0 model, which California has implemented with Sonoma Clean Power and Marin Clean Energy. And in that kind of 2.0 model where you have a municipal agency leading the aggregation, there are a more robust set of benefits. However, CCA 3.0 builds upon that model and addresses some of the major limitations of CCA 1.0 and 2.0 models. So the limitations of the current CCA models are really around equity, justice, and participation. So a just energy transition requires the intentional participation of historically excluded populations and opportunities for wealth building to repair the harms of the past. Right now, the current bulk purchasing models use market mechanisms like renewable energy certificates in lieu of community-owned, community-controlled local renewable energy. And customers are not meaningfully engaged on energy uses beyond their electricity supply. So you get a change in your electricity supply that is renewable through what's called renewable energy certificates. However, it doesn't address the decarbonization of buildings, energy efficiency, usage reductions, energy storage, and things like that. So although customers may experience bill discounts, they're not really given any sort of opportunities for joint ownership of projects and wealth generation, which are really important tenets of energy democracy. So the CCA 3.0 model hopes to really alleviate these limitations and make for a more participatory and more democratic and more just CCA model. So I'm going to pass it over to Paul Fenn, who is going to dive into CCA 3.0, how it works and what it means.
Thank you, Jasmine. I really appreciate the opportunity to address you. And so please, next slide. I wanted to start with this image of the Thwaites Glacier. I'm sure you've all heard about it because I like to start these presentations with a reminder, you don't need it in this group, but nevertheless, that we're in a failure scenario. and that we've had we now have the prospect of, in the next 3 years of this gigantic glacier, half the size of the United Kingdom, breaking off, and with the prospect of really catastrophic displacement of the world's coastal populations in a 10-year period. Something that has been anticipated really for a long time, but now it's happening. And I like to remind people that when we have these discussions that we're in a failure scenario, and that should contextualize the discussion. We should try to disengage ourselves from the conventional incrementalism of the past 25 years. Next slide, please. Which has been really a process what I like to call faking change. It's also a process of just starting new industries. But all the policies that we have on the current menu of at the state level, the federal level, the international level are essentially incremental in nature. The renewable energy certificates, as Jasmine just mentioned, carbon credit trading systems, our mitigation models that mitigate the impacts of power plants, but do not close power plants. They have zero impact essentially on actual emissions from power plants. And beyond that, an improved model for renewable energy development, such as net energy metering or virtual net metering, also present inherently limited and severely limited horizons of system impacts because of their funding sources. Most states are limited to 5% of system-wide load. The funding sources limit them, the eligibility to participate in those programs in a manner that essentially is terminal. It's a dead-end street with the systems focused on exporting onto the grid and having little to no impact at the building level of actually reducing the demand levels on the grid, which would, if they existed, also close power plants. And so they don't close power plants. And then third, more recently, we have community distributed generation, which is in New York, which is an effort to improve on the model, but it's based on an even more severely limited funding source than net energy metering, and is also an export vehicle. So none of these models actually reduce demand levels that are required to close power plants. And without closing power plants, you don't reduce emissions. So I like to call it a policy ghetto. Next slide, please. In the sense that you can't get out of a ghetto, you're trapped to the extent that you accept these policies. Next slide.
Paul, sorry to interrupt you, but we have a couple people saying that you're a little hard to hear. So if you could speak up, that would be awesome.
Okay, sorry about that.
Thank you.
So the basic structure of these current policies are to pay the wealthy based on skimming funds from the non-wealthy and giving it to them, retaining utility control of the process, and studiously avoiding changes on the system. The renewable energy certificate and carbon credit systems increase consumer cost in order to participate. And so they are inherently premium products, which depend upon a consumer's ability to pay more for energy in order to implement them. The export tariffs, net metering in particular, as I said, are capped within a very small fraction of utility power sold. And community distributed generation artificially lowers the prices for a few participants, limiting CDG to a pilot scale, which it physically cannot exceed without some other funding source that's not on the map. So I like to refer to this as tokenism. Next slide, please. They're also, as policies, ring fence. They're limited within just the scope of electricity, which shows only 1/4 of carbon emissions in terms of addressable carbon, as it's defined by the United Nations, that the municipalities can actually impact. And so, in other words, they don't include heating and hot water.
Paul, you may have muted yourself.
Am I back?
Yes.
I hope you heard me mention heating and hot water in vehicles. Okay, great. And then landfills and sewage exports continue to be dumped into oceans and burned in the air all across the country, either exported onto barges or burned, which is going on in cities all over America today. So, including among many 100% renewable energy CCAs, I would mention. So we need a new economic system in order to make real changes across the board. In other words, to be able to affect all addressable carbon, we need a new system. And specifically, we need to go beyond the ownership structure of the current system. To the extent that we're protecting that ownership structure, change is simply unaffordable. The vast majority of people are poor, and most businesses are small. That's a vast majority. Both of these are excluded categorically from voluntary investment in the current system, limited to large businesses and affluent homeowners, with very few exceptions. So we need to shift from policies that engage the 10% of the most affluent part of the population to engaging the 90%. And we have to do it voluntarily. So we don't have the means of forcing the change upon people. And so to the extent that it must be voluntary, it can't simply involve a premium. It goes back to the problem of premium pricing and depending on people to pay extra to sacrifice, this sort of sacrifice model of green energy. And so that's where equity comes in. That equity is really the opportunity to engage the 90% in the energy transition because it compensates them for that cost. To the extent that you are simply paying extra as a sacrifice, a minority is going to do that. But to the extent that you get something back for it, return on investment, that you get the benefits of ownership, okay, there's logic to that. And so in essence, the idea of the ratepayer is really core to the problem. We need to make energy ratepayers, to remake them into owners of their energy supply. And it goes to the need for a new economic system. Next slide, please. So CCA was really always intended to create this kind of leverage, to create the structural conditions for a transfer of control from suppliers to users of energy. Now, there have been many efforts to do that. Deregulation, part of the idea was to give consumers power over choice, right? But it did it by isolating them as individuals. And CCA does it by giving it to them in the aggregate. But it does it in a number of ways. It enables them to take over electricity and gas accounts on an opt-out enrollment basis. And across the country, there are 85% of customers are retained on average through that mechanism. So you get the bulk of the population in that manner to purchase together and to have the purchasing power on that basis. Just as importantly, CCAs have rate design and rate setting authority, unlike investor-owned utilities themselves, who have to get regulatory approval for every single decision that's made in their procurement activities. CCAs have a great deal of flexibility over deciding how their systems should work, and that's very important and underutilized. They have unique access to customer energy uses data, which has been one of the real barriers to the commercialization of green power. The fact that only the utilities have held that data, and they've protected that data to protect their market power. And so CCAs, one of the big breakthroughs of CCAs is being able to get access to that data so you can see what the community is doing with energy and see where the opportunities are and see what kinds of technologies would be beneficial to each customer. You've got the ability to recover your administrative costs, and that's a major barrier for all government programs in energy to be able to fund their programs. And so they're self-funding. And finally, they present the opportunity as municipal structure to use local government in a progressive way, the resources that are native to local governments that they already have in place, that are already funded to augment whether administrative systems or financial resources in the form of things like green bonds. And so CCA is leveraged for a new system. Next slide, please. All right, so today in America, there are 1,800 municipalities that are CCAs. It's about 36 million Americans that are served by them. Half of the US energy market allows CCA, and out of the 72 US cities that have 100% renewable energy today, 67 of them are CCAs. So it's a mature system, and it has got a lot of behind it in terms of demonstrated success, and a great variety of programs, and just a lot of water under that bridge. Next slide. In terms of the evolution, this started as a very simple idea of buying greener power. And it was meant to be very simple so that it would get launched, so that municipalities would do it. Started in Massachusetts in 25 years ago or so. And to get greener power that was not more expensive, and it was successful at doing that. But it was also very limited, the way that Jasmine described it, in terms of the overuse of renewable energy certificates in particular, but also just a short-term mentality that led us to develop CCA 2.0 in California, really starting around 2000, but we say 2010 to 2020 because that's really when the action started, because we had a big regulatory battle over it, and the fight with PG&E. You heard Prop 16, and that idea was to create a system that would enable the direct development and construction and financing of green power at competitive rates. And it was a big success. And it really was the thing that made CCA as a policy, because there was very little development of CCA 1.0 really. There was Cape Light Compact and a few others. But in California, it led to a great deal of development. It's got 200 municipalities today that are in the program, 10 gigawatts of new renewables built, 10 million customers just in California. So that was really exciting, but it also led us to realize the limits that I was just describing, that led us to develop the 3.0 program based on a frank appraisal of the potential of CCA to deliver climate action in that way across the board. And so 3.0 is designed, as a local Green New Deal or an energy transition structure for community-wide energy decarbonization while maintaining competitive rates. And so each of these steps was a huge step in terms of the potential to change the system. Next slide, please. So this slide is really important because it's the CCA 3.0 model is very much focused on voluntary investment. It goes back to that issue of how do you get lots of people, the vast majority, to participate in voluntary investment. And so it deals with the major barriers that we encountered in the 2.0 model. While it was very successful in developing big wind farms, big solar farms, big solar plus storage facilities, the gigantism really was the dominant paradigm of that. We need to get into buildings. We need to get into ownership by customers, ownership by the communities. And so the major barriers here, technological complexity, major barrier. Just being able to evaluate these technologies, is very difficult, and for people to know how to make those decisions. And so the model includes a data tailored, using that data that CCAs can get, tailoring distributed energy resource packages. Those are solar, storage, energy efficiency, renewable heating, all of the in-building renewable technologies, tailoring packages using the data to help people navigate technological complexity. Secondly, ownership requirements of conventional energy, the requirement that people own the building that they're in to be eligible. We developed a shares model so that people who are renters, who are low income, who are in multifamily housing, small businesses that rent, could participate without owning the buildings that they're in based on a shares model. Consumer isolation. Many of the most cost-effective renewable energy technologies are very capital intensive, like geothermal heating loops in particular, $50,000 for a system to put it in. So for individuals buying those alone, very expensive, not really tenable. But if you have a condominium, a complex multifamily building, right, or multi-use areas where the multiple units can share the same heating system, it becomes very cost effective, much more cost effective than air source heat pumps, for example. So we developed a cooperative service within the model. Thank you. Credit requirements, which are prohibitive. If you don't have a 630, 650 credit rating, you're not eligible for most of solar energy products. We developed a municipal loan assistance component. To overcome the limitations of net metering that I mentioned, we developed a non-exporting microgrid design, really, for in terms of the primary technological strategy. And the restrictive utility billing that has blocked on-bill financing, we have replaced with a municipal loan administration that involves using the municipal government to support a loan structure that coordinates with the CCA administration to enable, in effect, an on-bill financing opportunity. So it's a new structure which enables a new system. Next slide, please. So specifically, we're looking at addressing the shortcomings of 2.0 in spite of its success around trying to really focus on customer engagement, voluntary investment, and resilience and energy efficiency, which was one of the real shortcomings of 2.0. The model is focused on block level development of facilities, looking at the city block or the town block as the main unit of development, and within that, 1 to 3 buildings. We're looking at multi-adjacent building development in order to achieve economies of scale and be able to afford the increased cost of engineering that's involved. The program is centered on voluntary investment and can use either municipal or private finance. Next slide, please. In terms of what's built, we're looking, at all these sectors here: the heating sector, the power sector. We're looking at electric vehicles as an important energy storage resource. We're looking at municipal buildings, at multifamily buildings. We're looking at heating and hot water systems, and we're looking at multi-use areas in cities. And so it is a building retrocommissioning model based on microgrids and thermal loops with multiple layers of energy storage to facilitate a non-exporting permit configuration. Next slide, please. So it involves, the structure administratively involves a CCA agency to handle the energy facing part of the program, a department within each municipality in the CCA to handle the energy loan part of the program. It employs building cooperatives for residents and businesses that have the desire and the capacity to physically share on-site energy systems and heating systems. And then for individuals who do not, whose building owner will not participate, but they want to as renters, we have the share system. Next slide, please. All right, well, thank you. I hope I've done it in time, but that presents it. If you'd like to download the detailed document that outlines this program, you can download it by, I don't know if you can click on this link, but you can find it at localpower.com or localgreennewdeal.org. So I'll pass it back to you, Jasmine.
Fabulous. Now we will have Meghan Shaw of the City of Cambridge.
Thanks, Jasmine, and thanks, Paul. So I'm going to just take a step back and talk a little bit about how CCA has evolved in Cambridge, and try to share a little bit more about how specifically CCA 3.0 implementation is working here. So In 2017, the city of Cambridge launched our CCA, and part of our efforts to green that first run at the CCA was to ask our electricity supplier, the competitive electricity supplier, to buy SRECs from new Massachusetts solar projects on behalf of our CCA participants. And to some of Paul's points, this was still charging our participants a cost premium, though that premium wasn't really seen by our customers, primarily because the supply rate was competitive with the basic service offered by the utility. So we started off trying to focus on like, hey, how can we invest locally in renewable energy? But we were still relying on buying RECs, even though they were local RECs. So moving on to 2019 and 2021, we started to actually collect directly from our participants an operational adder. This is a small adder on every kilowatt of electricity, and the city collects this in a revolving fund, and we are deploying those funds on new additional local solar projects. So we recently finished building a new solar project on the Graham and Parks Elementary School that is essentially collectively owned by our CCA participants. Though again, this solar project still relies on net metering. So we'll be retiring the RECs from the solar project on behalf of our participants so that they benefit from the carbon reduction. But we are still net metering all of the power and reinvesting that revenue back into our revolving fund and into future solar projects. So you can see we're stuck in a little bit of like what Paul has been describing, right? We're still kind of reliant on this REC and net metering system. So the news doesn't get any better because in 2022, now the focus of the city leadership has shifted to trying to use our operational adder to invest in a large offsite new renewable project through a virtual power purchase agreement. And most likely this virtual power purchase agreement will invest in a new renewable project, but it will be outside of the New England grid. And if anyone knows about power purchase agreements and virtual power purchase agreements, they're essentially just a financial hedge within the energy market. So again, we're still kind of stuck in the same kind of old way of thinking about how to decarbonize electricity supply, and none of these actions are really focusing on what CCA 3.0 is trying to focus on, which is the demand side decarbonization. The home I am sitting in Cambridge, Massachusetts right now, even though I'm signed up with the CCA and I'm signed up with our 100% green option, my furnace is still running on natural gas, and my car still has gasoline in it. So this idea of how do we tackle that demand at the source and actually begin to retrofit our buildings and businesses, where the carbon emissions are occurring. Next slide, please. So tied into this history of our CCA is even going further back when the city of Cambridge launched the Cambridge Energy Alliance in 2007. And in some ways, this was a first attempt to focus on demand side reduction by creating a kind of an outreach and engagement arm for the city to drive up voluntary participation in the statewide energy efficiency program called Mass Save. So the city started off really trying to focus on like, how do we get more people to adopt energy efficiency retrofits within their homes and businesses? And over the years, we've grown the program scope of the Clean Energy Alliance, the Cambridge Energy Alliance. And we've added a multifamily retrofit program, a clean heating program. So even though these programs are focused on demand side, we still face a lot of challenges with voluntary participation, right? Say the challenges that Paul pointed out: lack of access to capital for people to afford to switch to air source heat pumps or install energy efficiency upgrades or purchase on-site solar. We have 60% of our city is renters. or the benefits they gain financially from energy efficiency and renewable energy ownership. Next slide, please. So in trying to marry these two things, right? We have our aggregation and it's operating. It's maybe a little off course right now by focusing in these large offsite renewable investments. But we also have this long-standing vehicle of the Cambridge Energy Alliance that has these barriers that I really believe can be addressed by adopting a CCA 3.0 model. And where we are on implementing it is really trying to figure out, how do we undo a lot of what Paul was speaking about, which is this, this supply side mentality, and how do we create and transform the Cambridge Energy Alliance into something that really is, doing wealth building within our city and doing job creation within our city while simultaneously accomplishing decarbonization and resilience and climate resilience too. So we're trying to find the legal vehicle that we can use to administer CCA 3.0. What is the agency that will administer this program? We've looked at like an enterprise fund, like our water department. We're looking into how redevelopment authorities can be authorized. Maybe we can create an energy redevelopment authority, or we're looking into joint powers agreements. We're also really trying to investigate the funding sources. We have this operational adder that's already being collected by the city. The Massachusetts state laws allows aggregations like the Cape Light Compact, and our aggregation could do the same to actually take the statewide energy efficiency and renewable energy funds and deploy them locally and not have to go through the utility programs. We're considering creating a local carbon fund for large buildings that will be regulated under our local carbon ordinance. Paul mentioned green bonds, private equity and capital, and of course there's grant and philanthropic sources that might be interested in funding this type of organizational change. And we're also trying to learn from other models like the Philadelphia Energy Authority and the Ann Arbor Sustainable Energy Utility. Next slide, please. So that's all to say that I think you can get a sense from Paul's presentation that this is really a fundamental shift in how people think about decarbonization, right? We've been really reliant on using RECs and supply side investments. And so I really think the biggest challenge with implementing CCA 3.0 is really challenging this mindset. I see us having to really educate city councilors and city leadership and other stakeholders, on the fundamental inability of RECs and supply side investments to truly decarbonize. And, I think we also need to really find a way to, put pen to paper and carry out, how do we make sure that the installation of renewable energy on site is going to be, and energy efficiency is going to actually pencil out as revenue neutral or revenue positive. If you could just go forward to one more slide. Sorry, one more. Yeah, so I guess what I'm saying is that, the challenges with implementing this aren't just administrative. They really are about moving an entire economic system that is based on, one person owning one object to cooperative ownerships and shares being sold. And it's really a philosophical shift that is not even supported, by Massachusetts state law with how net metering and RECs and all those things function within our legal and legislative framework. Next slide, please. So that really leads me to what I think is the fundamental lesson that I've learned so far, even though I'm very early on the journey of implementing CCA 3.0 in Cambridge, which is that the community, elected officials and decision makers and activists must truly understand the promise of aggregation 3.0. We kind of have to get everyone on the same page with what what aggregation 3.0 can bring to our community. We have to have everyone really understand that local demand reduction, inclusive engagement, and financial equity opportunities for everyone to participate in is really the key to both our decarbonization goals and our environmental justice goals. So I would just really encourage folks that are on this call and thinking about, wow, I'm trying to wrap my head around it, really trying to think about how to message and take this message of aggregation 3.0 into your community, and into your conversations with decision makers, so that everyone knows where we're trying to go with aggregation 3.0 and what it can bring to our communities in terms of achieving our goals around both environmental justice and decarbonization and resilience.
Back to me. All right. Thank you so much, Megan. So just in closing, I'm going to wrap up with some of the key takeaways and really give you an idea of what we need to get here. So right now, the current CCA models are significantly restrained by using market mechanisms like RECs, by not being inclusive. Right now, the current CCA models are really at direct odds with energy democracy and participatory justice, because these are opt-out programs that don't meaningfully engage communities, customers, individuals, households, et cetera. And so right now they are inherently inequitable and replicating environmental injustices. So in order to meet our ambitious goals in New York and beyond, we have to be willing to transform our energy system. That's a non-negotiable. And we can use models like CCA 3.0. Also going to put in a little plug here for public power, which is also very important. And we need to design systems that are not just inclusive of these vulnerable populations, but ones that prioritize them. We need to repair the harms that the fossil fuel industry did. And if we move in our clean energy transition without addressing the injustices that have occurred, we will replicate the same harms. It will be a very similar set of people holding wealth, holding ownership, holding power, and preventing others from generating wealth and ownership. So as Megan identified, as Paul identified, as I identified, it is very, very important that we think about this as a fundamental shift, where we are encouraging voluntary engagement, where we are doing the work with boots on the ground, especially in this winter, big snow boots on the ground, and we are engaging communities. It is important, and we will not meet our climate goals by only engaging a certain subsector of people. So we know that our legislators, our executives are not going to get there on our own. This kind of transformation requires people power. And gratefully, we've got a lot of people on this webinar right now who are learning about what this model can bring. And I see a lot of chatter in the Q&A, and we're going to get right into that, because it is important that you all understand how this works, because we need organizers, we need community groups, activists, and also engineers and lawyers and scholars and everybody to build power for a just energy transition. So with that, I will pass it to Avni, who will moderate our Q&A. And thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Jasmine, for that galvanizing call to action. I'm feeling pumped up, and I'm excited to say that after the Q&A, we'll actually have a little way that folks can get started with taking action. So stay tuned for that. But without further ado, let's jump into some of the questions, because people had some really interesting points. So from Janet, we have: what protections exist for consumers if CCAs don't have to answer to regulatory pressures on rates? So Paul, I think this is a great question for you and Megan as well, with your experience in Massachusetts.
I can say that, given that CCAs in Massachusetts, the customers can opt out at any time. So, so I guess the way that customers could display their displeasure with CCA setting rates, too high would be to leave the CCA and return to their utility basic service, or, in Massachusetts, there's also many other competitive suppliers that consumers could receive their power from. So they could vote with their feet, so to say.
No, that's right. CCAs have to be competitive and are. So they thank goodness they don't have to answer to regulatory pressures, because I think it would probably drive their rates higher. Instead, they're left essentially to sink or swim on their own, and they've done a good job at that.
And I'll just add here that in New York State, CCAs are not able to serve low-income customers who use the home energy assistance program. And so right now, some of the most vulnerable New Yorkers with the highest energy burdens can't actually participate in CCA. And so CCA 3.0 could be a way to meaningfully engage those folks who right now don't even have an avenue to participate in CCA 1.0 or 2.0.
Jasmine. All right, we'll move on to Carol. Can you send a link to the list of 72 cities and the 67 that are doing it with renewable energy? So everyone's favorite question on the webinar is, will the slides be sent out? So we're going to send the slides out to everyone. And for any questions that aren't answered through the slides, feel free to reach out and we'll follow up via email. So next, what are the major barriers specifically in New York to implementing CCAs? Jasmine, I'm going to throw this over to you.
Yeah, a lot of people think of CCA as a really large lift. I managed Sustainable Westchester's CCA for 4 years, and I will say that we were a very bare bones operation. So it is not maybe as difficult as one would think. I would say that some of the greatest hurdles are understanding the regulations. For example, if you are a CCA, you need to have a very in-depth data protection plan, an implementation plan, and other documents that, are difficult to navigate on your own. However, NYCERDA does have a toolkit online. And then beyond that, I would say, you have to have municipal buy-in. You have to be trusted in the community. A lot of folks have been burned very badly by energy supply companies or ESCOs. And so there's a lot of distrust in the community. So if you can demonstrate that you are providing a benefit, that you care about the community, and you use the support of NYCERDA and other energy experts like Paul, then you have a pretty good shot at creating a CCA. But I would say there's definitely a learning curve, and there's a lot of distrust. So you have to be very intentional about how you create it.
Thank you, Jasmine. That was a great answer. And we have another great question from Carol. Do municipalities administer these themselves in-house, or do most of them contract with private companies to administer them? What is the track record of savings going to residents versus the private company? How to ensure the private company commits to renewable energy? So that's a meaty question that I'm going to throw over to Paul and Meghan afterwards.
Okay, it's a great question and super important. One of the biggest takeaways for us, we've been sort of tracking CCA all the past 20 years, and was the fact that the most accomplished programs in renewable energy around the country have been those that had strong local capacity, like Cambridge, right, where you've got not just perfunctory staff, but very capable staff with a strong local democratic process where resource decisions are made, not avoided. Those are the communities that have been successful in developing significant new local renewable resources, implementing innovative programs. And so we take a very strong position on that if you try to do this the easy way too much, if it's too easy, that's the 1.0 model. We made it easy because we wanted it to happen 25 years ago. And it did happen, but it just didn't have any teeth. It didn't, it didn't result in substantive systemic change. And it was really programs like Cambridge, like the Cape Light Compact in Massachusetts, and then in California, where you had public agency aggregations, that's where we got this really big bang of the 10 gigawatts of development. That simply has nothing close to that has happened anywhere. And I attribute that primarily to the fact that public agencies were created. It's not a perfect model 2.0 because they were kind of too gigantist in their approach. That's where 3.0 is trying to blend layers, to say, okay, you need to have strong local capacity within the municipality in terms of the CCA department or administrator, like Cambridge Energy Alliance, where it's closely linked to the municipality. Then you need to build coordination within the municipality to use its systems to reach the community. And then you need to have in the civil society cooperatives, organizational structure in the civil society outside the government to really bring people to the table and not rely on any kind of one model, but a strictly outsourcing approach, which has been taken mostly in most of Massachusetts, using brokers, we really regard as one of the real weak spots of the model, because the outsourcing has uniformly resulted where companies are simply hired with little or no staff to turnkey the whole thing, has resulted in virtually no program development, no knowledge development in the local government, and a kind of stasis where the program simply launches and it stays the same way and no one hardly even knows it's there. So I know what your thoughts are, Megan.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. And I would say that just to give this exact example, in Cambridge, I am a municipal employee who is tasked with running our community aggregation program. And I live in the community development department and have a strong focus in my role on leading our climate mitigation strategies, not just within the CCA work that I do. And so that's the municipal staff piece of this, but we do rely on a consultant to run the administrative piece of our CCA. They are closely partnered with the city on this, right? Like we dictate the work that those consultants do. One of the reasons that we use a program administrator is because there is a challenge with this, with me as a city staffer having access to the same utility bill data that our consultant is able to access to run the CCA, primarily because of Freedom of Information Act laws. So that is why there is this kind of separation. But that's not to say that this is not a program that's set on autopilot. The city is constantly, iterating on this strategy, and the whole commitment to CCA 3.0 is actually enshrined in the city's net zero action plan for buildings around how we will get our buildings to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So we really do have this enshrined in our sort of policy making and climate change mitigation strategy.
Meghan, all right, I know we're running low on time for questions and we have a ton of good ones. So I'm gonna just skip to one that I think a lot of us are curious about. So this is from Amanda M. CCA 3.0 sounds like it assumes a lot of administrative involvement of municipal governments, like loan assistance, loan administration. How will this be possible for small municipalities, many of which have few, if any, full-time employees? And I think this is a perfect question for you, Meghan, if you don't mind me throwing it back to you.
Oh, I was hoping you were going to say Paul first. No, I guess I guess I do agree with the sentiment behind Amanda, and that is something that we like. I am currently trying, I rely on Paul to try to help walk us through this, but there is going to be the need to create some additional capacity, I think, to truly embody every aspect of what CCA 3.0 can become. I one of the things that that I think is important to understand is that, I think a lot of cities and towns do have this capacity. And I think Paul could expand on this point in other areas, right? So they invest in someone to do tax collecting or to send out water bills or to set, to make sure that, excise taxes are paid. So there is an administrative capacity for things within the city. With many cities, I'm not saying that all cities or towns have these capacities, but that's why I come back to this idea that you really need the city or town or the groups of cities and towns to embrace the idea of aggregation 3.0, so that there is a willingness to invest in some of that capacity within the city. The other thing I will mention is that technically in Massachusetts, the operational adder that we're collecting right now, that we're using to build new solar capacity for our residents, Massachusetts state law does allow aggregations to spend that to have administrative staff and pay that administrative staff. So that is just one place where that funding could come from in some capacity. I don't know if New York state law is similarly aligned with that.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that, Megan, and I think that we're working with some communities in New York and with some small towns and some cities, and the resources are really, as you said, inside the existing envelope of services. Every small town has tax bills. Usually they have water bills. These are billing platforms that can be used to reach out to consumers in a way that the CCA bill simply cannot, because it's under the utilities control, not the municipality's control. So it's really, I like to call it a dating game. It's like a dating game. You're setting up an administrative communication system to engage people, educate them, inform them, and enroll them, so that it has a very light administrative structure that is well adapted to towns. In cities, a more robust approach can be taken. So what we're doing is we're going to cities in regional CCAs, going to the larger municipalities, encouraging them to act as the lead agencies, because they have that capacity, but also they have the more stronger political will, often with the clearer kind of policy goals and commitment, and therefore they can kind of set the standard and the template and the example, at the same time providing the administrator role with the smaller towns to encourage them and educate them and engage them in the process over time. So I definitely recognize the challenge, and that's why the model we developed uses this layering approach, where it's not placing all the burden on any one agency. It sort of tries to spread it out in an elegant way, so that no one has to do anything entirely new and heavy to make it work. It just requires some cooperation between layers. We feel that should work even in rural areas, although they do have to adapt their products to a rural environment versus an urban environment. There's definitely some translation to be done in the process.
Right. Thank you, Paul and Megan, for tackling that one. There's way too many awesome questions for us to address, unfortunately. With the time that we have left, we want to respect y'all's evenings and let you be able to unwind. So what we're going to do is compile all the remaining questions, and we'll send those out after with some thoughts from the panelists. So thank you for making them work for you. We're going to get some really great knowledge out of that. And so hopefully you'll keep an eye out for that email and the recording afterwards. So let's go on to the take action, which you were all promised. Next slide, please. Okay. Oh, first we have the resources, which have already been a little bit mentioned. Jasmine mentioned the NYCP toolkit, which is a great resource for municipalities and local governments and CCA administrators. And Bryn, thank you for dropping that in the chat. There's the link to it. There's also the CCA administrator request for proposals template, and this also will help up and coming CCAs find projects and get started on the best foot possible. So please do check those out if you are in this position. All right, so the first way that you can take action if you're local to the Mid-Hudson area, really exciting. The Mid-Hudson Energy Transition is an up-and-coming nonprofit CCA administrator looking to implement CCA 3.0 in Kingston, New York. So you can check them out online, and you can also learn more at localpower.com about CCAs in general, CCA 3.0 in general. And then next, as Jasmine closed out with, public power is obviously a really important piece of this puzzle. So you can learn more about how public power is making waves in New York at www.publicpowernewyork.org. Also in the chat. And then we also have a small action that you can take. We really need to see the Build Public Renewables Act committed to in the state budget. So I believe for the next 30 days, we have a chance to get this in the budget. It's not in the current iteration. So if you can call Governor Kathy Hochul, Bryn is going to drop in the call number and the call script in the chat. And this is important because the Build Public Renewables Act would actually scale up the largest public power entity that we have in the US, the New York Power Authority, to build more renewable energy, which would create thousands of state jobs and help us meet our ambitious climate goals. So if you have a moment this evening, please do call the office. And I believe now we just want to say thank you to all of our awesome sponsors. So big thanks to Citizens for Local Power for co-sponsoring this. Also New Yorkers for Clean Power, who did a lot of the tech and outreach. So if you heard about this, it was likely through them. Thank you so much. And also the Mid-Hudson Energy Transition, which is doing so much of the implementation and on the ground work. And thank you also to all of you for taking time out of your evenings to learn about this and hopefully take some of those actions.